The words hit me like a slap. Pay the rent or move out. My own son's voice, raised and sharp, bounced off the kitchen walls, slicing through the quiet of a Sunday morning. For a moment, I thought I'd misheard him. I stood there, spatula in hand, halfway through flipping pancakes, staring at him as if he were a stranger. He didn't flinch. His eyes were hard, his jaw tight, the same stubborn line his father used to wear when he was angry, except my husband's anger had never been aimed at me. My son, my only child, stood there in the home where I had brought him after he was born, the same home where I painted his nursery walls a soft yellow and stayed up through countless fevers, whispering lullabies until he slept. Did you just say that to me? My voice cracked. You heard me, Mom, he replied, arms folded across his chest. It's not fair that you live here for free while I'm covering all the bills. Times are tough. Either you start paying rent or you'll have to find somewhere else to stay. Stay. The word twisted in my gut, as if I were some guest who had overstayed her welcome. I opened my mouth, but the only sound that came out was a faint breath. He was wrong. Not just in his tone, but in his facts. This house, my house, was paid off long before he graduated high school. The bills he claimed to cover were utilities I'd been quietly paying from my own dwindling savings. I set the spatula down. This is my home, I said slowly, each word deliberate. I bought it with your father. We paid it off together before you even knew what a mortgage was. He gave a short, dismissive laugh. Yeah, but times have changed. I'm the one handling the money now, and things have to be fair. Fair. That word echoed in my chest like an insult. Fair was working double shifts while he went to college debt-free. Fair was skipping vacations so he could have braces, a car, and every chance his father and I never had. I felt the burn behind my eyes, but I refused to let the tears fall in front of him. Instead, I turned back to the stove, sliding the pancakes onto a plate, my hands steady though my insides shook. We'll talk later, I said quietly. Yeah, he said, already walking away, his footsteps heavy on the stairs. Think about it. But I didn't need to think. The decision was already beginning to form in the deepest part of me, not out of anger, but out of something colder, sharper. In that moment, I knew something between us had shifted forever, and there would be no going back. That night, the house felt different. Quieter, but not in the peaceful way I used to enjoy after a long day. This was a silence edged with something sharp, a weight pressing down on me with every tick of the clock. I sat in the living room with the lamp on low, my tea cooling untouched on the table, and let the words replay in my mind. Pay the rent or move out. I'd known disappointment before. I'd known exhaustion so deep it felt like my bones were hollow. But betrayal, real betrayal, has a sound. It's the voice of someone you love turning cold, stripping away the shared history, the unspoken promises, until you're just another problem for them to solve. I thought of the years after his father died. How I'd taken on 3 jobs just to keep the mortgage paid, the lights on, food in the fridge. I thought of the night shifts at the diner, my feet aching so badly I had to soak them before bed, just to get up and do it again. Of the afternoons I'd sat in my old car outside the grocery store, counting crumpled bills and deciding what to put back so I could still afford his soccer fees. He had never gone without. Not for food, not for clothes, not for love. I'd been at every school concert, every game, every parent-teacher meeting. Even when I was bone-tired, I'd clap the loudest, cheer the hardest, because I wanted him to feel supported, to know that no matter how small the stage, he had someone in his corner. And this was what I got in return. I pressed my fingers to my temples, willing the memory of his voice away, but it stayed, harsh and patient, so unlike the little boy who used to run down the hall in mismatched pajamas, dragging a blanket behind him, calling, "Mom, watch!" before showing me some new trick. Somewhere along the way, he'd grown into a man who thought of me as an expense. The sting wasn't just in the words. It was in the absence of gratitude, the rewriting of our story, as though my years of sacrifice were nothing more than an extended free ride. And I couldn't help but wonder, had I done this? Had I made it too easy, shielded him too much from hardship, so that he believed the world owed him comfort without effort? The tea had gone cold by the time I finally moved. I turned off the lamp, letting the room fall into darkness, but the heaviness didn't lift. It followed me up the stairs, into bed, into the space where I used to feel safe. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, one thought burning clearer than the rest. Love had built this home, but something far stronger, and far sadder, was going to take it apart. He waited until the next morning to bring it up again, as if the night had given him time to sharpen his argument. I was at the kitchen table, sorting through the mail, when he came in holding a sheet of paper. His tone was casual, almost businesslike, but there was a tension under it that made my stomach knot. "I've worked out the numbers," he said, sliding the paper toward me, as though we were strangers negotiating a lease. "If you're going to stay here, I think this is fair, $800 a month. That covers your share of utilities, property taxes, and upkeep." I stared at the neat columns of figures he'd scrawled in pen, the numbers boxed in like facts carved in stone. 800. My pension barely covered groceries, prescriptions, and a few bills I already paid. I could no more produce that amount every month than I could sprout wings and fly. "I told you," I said carefully, "this is my house. Your father and I." He cut me off with a quick slice of his hand. "Yeah, I know. You and Dad paid it off. But that was then. Times have changed. I'm the one taking care of things now, and it's not fair for me to carry the whole load while you—" He stopped, his eyes flicking over me in a way that made me feel small. "While you contribute nothing." Nothing. The word landed heavier than any dollar amount. All the years of keeping this place running, of fixing broken faucets myself, repainting rooms, replacing worn carpet, suddenly erased in his mind. All the nights I'd stayed up with him through illness, the tuition I'd helped cover when scholarships fell short, none of it seemed to exist anymore. I pushed the paper back toward him. $800 is more than I can afford. You know that." He shrugged, as if that were a minor inconvenience. "Then maybe it's time to think about what's best for both of us. If you can't pay, you should find a place that fits your budget. It's not personal, it's just how life works." But it was personal. It was my son telling me I no longer belonged in the home I built for him. It was him looking me in the eye and treating me like a tenant whose lease had run out. "I'll think about it," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. He nodded, satisfied, and left the room, leaving the paper in front of me like a silent ultimatum. I sat there for a long time, staring at his careful calculations, my mind running over every sacrifice, every compromise I'd made to give him a better life. And in that moment, I knew he'd mistaken my silence for surrender. He had no idea that I was already thinking, but not about how to stay. About how to leave on my own terms. The house was still, the kind of quiet that presses against your ears and makes you too aware of your own breathing. I sat on the edge of my bed, the lamp casting a small circle of light across the quilt I'd sewn years ago from scraps of his old clothes, pieces of t-shirts from school field days, a square of flannel from his favorite pajamas. My hands rested on the soft fabric, and without warning, my eyes blurred. I had held it together all day. I had smiled faintly when he passed me in the hallway, kept my voice even when he asked if I'd thought about his proposal. I cooked dinner as usual, though my appetite was gone. But now, with the door shut and no one to see, the tears came hot and fast. When had he stopped seeing me as his mother? Not the woman who'd bandaged scraped knees and clapped the loudest at his graduations, but as something else, an expense, a weight. When had I turned from family into a ledger entry? I tried to trace it back. Maybe it was when he started working long hours, when his friends bought bigger houses and newer cars, and he began to measure worth in things that could be priced. Or maybe it was me. Maybe I'd made it too easy for him, shielding him from every bill, every hard choice, so he never learned that love isn't measured in what you can charge someone. The tears soaked into the quilt until the colors blurred. I hated that I was crying over him, hated that I still loved him enough to hurt this way. My chest ached with the kind of grief you can't bury in the ground, the kind that stays alive because the person who caused it is still walking around under the same roof. I pressed my face into my hands and tried to breathe through it, but the questions kept coming, each one sharper than the last. If his father were here, would he have let this happen? Would he have looked at our son and seen the stranger I saw tonight? Or would he have reminded him of the kind of man we'd raised him to be? The clock ticked past midnight, but sleep felt impossible. Eventually, I turned off the lamp and lay down, the quilt pulled to my chin. The moonlight spilled faintly through the blinds, striping the floor. Somewhere down the hall, I could hear his steady breathing through the walls, the sound of someone sleeping peacefully after telling his own mother she had to pay to stay. I stared into the dark, my tears drying into salt on my skin, and realized the truth I'd been avoiding all day. Something between us had broken, and I didn't know if either of us would ever be able, or willing, to fix it. The phone rang mid-morning, its sharp trill breaking the uneasy quiet that had settled over the house. I almost didn't answer. Lately, I hadn't felt much like talking to anyone, least of all someone who might hear the crack in my voice. But the caller ID read Nora, and something in me couldn't ignore it. "Hey, stranger," she said the moment I picked up, her voice warm and familiar, like stepping into a kitchen where coffee was already brewing. "I was just thinking about you. How's life treating you?" I tried to make my answer light. "Oh, you know, same old." But Nora had known me too long, long enough to read the truth in the pauses. "Don't you dare," she said. "I can hear it. What's wrong?" The lump in my throat rose faster than I could swallow it down. "It's complicated. Then uncomplicate it," she urged gently. "Start from the beginning." And before I knew it, the words spilled out, about my son standing in the kitchen, telling me to pay rent or move out, about the paper with his neat columns of numbers, about the cold way he'd said nothing when I listed what I already contributed. I told her about lying awake at night, wondering when he'd stopped seeing me as family. When I finished, there was a long silence on her end, broken only by the faint hum of traffic in the background. Then her voice came, steady and fierce. "You've got to stand up for yourself. You gave that boy everything, and now he's trying to treat you like a tenant in your own home? No, absolutely not. It's not that simple," I murmured. "He's my son, and you're his mother," she shot back. "Not his ATM, not his burden. If you let him keep talking to you like this, he'll believe it's okay. And it's not. You've worked too hard, sacrificed too much, to be made to feel small in your own house." Her words were like a match striking inside me, small at first, then growing hotter the more I let them sink in. Nora had been beside me during the years after my husband died, when I was juggling grief and bills and a boy who still needed lunches packed. She'd seen me pull myself out of holes deeper than this. "You deserve respect," she said. "From everyone. Especially him. Don't let him forget whose name is on that deed." We talked a little longer, her voice easing some of the tightness in my chest. By the time we hung up, the house felt different. Not lighter, exactly, but less suffocating. I set the phone down and sat at the table, letting her words echo. Don't let him forget whose name is on that deed. It wasn't a plan yet, but it was a beginning. And maybe, just maybe, it was the start of taking back something I hadn't realized I had lost, my place, my dignity, my say in how this story would end. The filing cabinet sat in the corner of my bedroom, its beige metal sides nicked and dented from decades of moves. It wasn't much to look at, but it held the entire paper trail of my adult life. Tax returns, birth certificates, insurance policies, and, somewhere in its belly, the document I suddenly needed to see with my own eyes. I pulled open the bottom drawer, the one that stuck if you didn't tug just right. The smell of old paper rose up, faintly dusty, tinged with the scent of manila folders. My fingers flipped through years and seconds. Utility bills, bank statements, my late husband's work records, the mortgage agreement we'd signed when we were young enough to believe nothing could shake us. And then, there it was, worn at the edges, folded in half from the last time I'd handled it. The property deed. I carried it to the bed and spread it out carefully, smoothing the creases with my palms. My name was printed in bold type across the top, my husband's beside it. Below, in neat black ink, the date we closed on the house, the notary's signature, the county seal embossed into the paper like a quiet, undeniable truth. After his death, I'd gone through the legal steps to have the title transferred solely to me. I remember the day the clerk handed me the updated document, how final it had felt, like being told the ship was mine to steer, for better or worse. I had kept the house running alone for years after that, every leaky pipe, every roof repair, every tax bill paid from my own pocket. I traced my name with one finger. No matter what my son said, no matter how he framed his fairness, this was still my home. Legally. Rightfully. A strange calm settled over me as I read each line, confirming what I already knew but needed to feel in my bones. His voice, "Times have changed, it's only fair," faded into the background. The ink on this page was older than his threats, stronger than his arguments. I refolded the deed and slipped it into a fresh plastic sleeve before returning it to the cabinet. But I didn't push the drawer closed right away. I stood there for a moment, my hand resting on the cool metal, thinking about how much had been built within these walls. The first steps he'd taken across this carpet. The nights we'd sat at the kitchen table with hot cocoa while a storm rattled the windows. This wasn't just a house. It was the story of my life, brick by brick, memory by memory. And now, someone who owed his very existence to it wanted to charge me rent for the privilege of staying. When I finally shut the drawer, it was with more certainty than I'd felt in weeks. Whatever came next, I wasn't going to be bullied out of what was mine. Not by a stranger. And certainly not by my own son. The smell of burnt toast hit me before I even stepped into the kitchen. My son was already at the table, scrolling on his phone with one hand and sipping coffee with the other. The morning light caught in his hair the way it used to when he was a boy, but the set of his jaw was harder now, his eyes fixed somewhere far from me. "Morning," I said, keeping my voice even. "Morning," he replied without looking up. Then, as if he'd been waiting for the cue, he set his phone down and leaned back in his chair. "I've been thinking about what we talked about the other day. I just want to make sure you understand. It's not personal. It's business." I poured myself coffee and sat down across from him, the steam curling between us. "Business? Yeah." He spoke with the confident tone of someone explaining something obvious. "The market's different now. Houses cost more to keep up, utilities keep going up, property taxes, it's all on me. I'm just saying, if you're living here, it's fair you contribute. Most people would be paying way more for a place like this. You should feel lucky I'm offering to let you stay for less than market rate." I took a slow sip, tasting bitterness that had nothing to do with the coffee. "Let me stay?" I asked quietly. He nodded, missing the edge in my tone. "Exactly. You've had it good for a long time. No rent, no big bills. But things change, Mom. I can't carry it all forever. This way, it's fair for both of us." I studied him, wondering if he even heard himself. The boy I'd once rocked to sleep was now speaking to me like a landlord explaining terms to a tenant. His words were polished, practiced, the kind of phrases you pick up from business podcasts and financial blogs. But underneath was a casual cruelty that cut deeper than any spreadsheet could measure. "Fair," I repeated, rolling the word over in my mouth like a stone. He mistook my pause for consideration. "Exactly. And honestly, I'm being generous. Most people wouldn't even think twice about charging full rent." I could have reminded him whose name was on the deed. I could have told him exactly what it had cost me to keep this roof over his head when the world felt like it was falling apart. But I didn't. Not yet. Instead, I watched him butter his toast with the calm of someone who believed the conversation was already decided. The toast crunched as he bit into it, the sound loud in the small kitchen. He chewed, swallowed, and added, "So, you'll think about it, right?" I smiled faintly, though it didn't reach my eyes. "Oh, I'm thinking about it," I said. And I was. Just not in the way he imagined. I was out front pulling a few stubborn weeds from the flower bed when I heard the screen door slam behind me. My son's voice followed, sharp and impatient. "You can't just ignore this, Mom. I need an answer. Rent starts next month." The words carried across the yard, cutting through the quiet of the morning. I straightened slowly, wiping my hands on my jeans, aware of the prickle of embarrassment that comes when private matters spill into open air. That's when I saw Mr. Daniels pause at the edge of his driveway, watering can in hand. He was in his late 70s, with a steady gait and eyes that missed very little. He glanced between me and my son, his brow knitting. My son didn't notice him. He was already walking back inside, muttering something about responsibility and dead weight. The door banged shut, leaving the air heavy in his wake. Mr. Daniels crossed the narrow strip of grass between our houses. "Everything all right?" he asked gently. I tried for a smile, but it came out thin. "Just a disagreement, I gathered." He set down his watering can and leaned on the fence post. Heard enough to know it's about the house. I hesitated, then nodded. He wants me to pay rent. Here. His eyebrows lifted, but he didn't interrupt. This house, I continued, is in my name. Always has been. But he's decided I should contribute or move out. Says it's only fair. Mr. Daniels let out a low whistle. Fair. Funny how that word can mean different things to different people. I folded my arms, suddenly feeling tired. I've been thinking maybe I should just go. Find somewhere smaller. Less trouble. He shook his head. Don't you dare make a decision from a place of hurt. That boy of yours might think he's running a business, but this isn't a business. It's your home. If he doesn't respect that, well, he let the thought trail off, but his eyes held mine, steady and unflinching. Then he leaned in a little, lowering his voice. If it were me, I'd remind him whose name is on that deed. And if he still couldn't see straight, I'd make a move he'd never forget. Something that puts you back in the driver's seat. I frowned. Like what? A slow smile crept over his face. You've got more options than you think, if you're willing to shake things up. He picked up his watering can and started back toward his yard. Just remember, sometimes the best way to win an argument is to stop having it and change the whole game instead. I stood there long after he'd gone, the hum of his words settling deep. Change the game. The phrase took root in my mind, quiet but alive. By the time I went back inside, I knew I wouldn't be packing boxes anytime soon. Not yet. First, I needed to see just how far I was willing to take this. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels almost fragile. I stood in the hallway for a moment, letting my eyes wander over the familiar scuffs and marks on the walls. Each one had a story, a little timestamp of a life fully lived here. I started in the living room, my hand brushing over the back of the old sofa. This was where we'd hosted birthday parties, the coffee table pushed aside to make room for wrapping paper chaos. I could still hear the high-pitched squeals of my son at 6 years old, tearing into gifts while his father grinned from the armchair, camera in hand. The dining room came next. I paused at the threshold, remembering Christmas dinners, where the table seemed too small for all the food and laughter crammed onto it. My late husband would carve the turkey with a dramatic flourish, making everyone groan at his terrible jokes. Even now, I could almost hear his laugh, deep and warm, the kind that wrapped around you and made you forget the world outside. In the kitchen, sunlight spilled across the worn linoleum, highlighting the faded spots where countless feet had stood over the years. This was where I had spent hours cooking meals that were more love than recipe. I could still picture my son sitting at the counter with a bowl of cereal, swinging his legs, telling me about school as if every detail was urgent and important. I made my way upstairs, the stairs creaking under my weight just as they always had. In the hallway, the growth chart was still penciled onto the wall, uneven lines marking the inches gained year after year. My son's name in clumsy block letters at the bottom, then gradually neater handwriting as the marks climbed higher. I stepped into what had once been his room. The posters were long gone, but I could see them in my mind. Spaceships, baseball players, and later, a band whose music I never understood but tolerated because it made him happy. The room smelled faintly of the cedar chest in the corner, the one his father had built before he was born. Finally, I stopped at my bedroom. I sat on the edge of the bed, looking at the small framed photo on the nightstand, our wedding day. His hand over mine, his eyes crinkling at the corners, as if he couldn't believe his luck. This house had been our shared dream, the place we planned to grow old together. I let the memories wash over me, both sweet and sharp. This house wasn't just walls and a roof. It was a vessel for love, for joy, for the life we'd built against every obstacle. And now my own son wanted to turn it into a transaction, stripping away the heart of it in favor of some cold ledger. The thought tightened something in my chest. Selling it suddenly didn't feel like loss. It felt like taking back the pen and deciding how the next chapter would be written. The message came through while I was rinsing dishes, the sound of the notification cutting through the steady trickle of water. I dried my hands on a dish towel and reached for my phone. It was from Nora. No preamble, no chit-chat, just a name, a phone number, and the words, "She's honest. Knows her stuff. Call her if you ever want to know what the place is worth." I stared at the screen for a long moment. The "just in case" was unspoken but loud. Nora knew me well enough not to push, but she also knew the seed had already been planted. A few minutes later, my phone buzzed again. This time it was a follow-up from her. Not saying you have to sell, but information is power. And you could use a little power right now. I set the phone down and leaned against the counter, letting her words sink in. She wasn't wrong. My son had been talking as if the house were his bargaining chip, the terms is to dictate. But the deed upstairs in my filing cabinet told another story. If I wanted to change the game, as Mr. Daniels had put it, I'd need to know exactly what I was holding in my hand. That evening, when my son left to meet friends, I pulled a small box of keepsakes from the top of the closet. Inside, under a stack of old holiday cards, I found the business card Nora had sent me a picture of. The cardstock was thick, the name printed in neat, raised letters, Elaine Foster, Residential Real Estate. Beneath that, a tagline, Your home, your terms. I traced the letters with my thumb, feeling a quiet current of resolve starting to hum through me. I didn't have to call her tonight. I didn't even have to call her this week. But the card was here now, tucked in the pocket of my wallet where I could feel its presence every time I reached for my change. Later, as I sat in the living room, I caught myself glancing around at the walls, the windows, the curve of the banister. For the first time in days, I imagined the house not as a battlefield but as an asset. Something I could use, not something I could lose. Upstairs, I heard the front door open and my son's voice drifting in, light and easy, as if nothing had been said between us. I didn't reply. I kept my eyes on the card, its crisp edges digging faintly into my fingers. Information is power. Nora's words echoed in my mind, steady and deliberate. And I was suddenly certain that, before long, I'd be making that call. Elaine arrived on a bright Wednesday morning, pulling up in a small navy sedan that gleamed in the sun. She stepped out with a leather folio tucked under her arm, dressed in a simple blazer and flats, her smile warm but efficient. I liked her immediately. No false cheer, just the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly what she was doing. We shook hands in the doorway, and I felt a strange flutter of nerves, as if I were letting her in on a secret. "Let's take a look," she said, glancing up at the crown molding as she stepped into the living room. I followed her as she moved through the house, her gaze sharp and assessing. She ran her fingers lightly along the banister, peeked into the closets, tapped the window frames, and crouched to check under the kitchen sink. All the while, she asked questions. When the roof was last replaced, the age of the furnace, whether the hardwood was original. I answered automatically, my mind drifting now, and then to the years I had spent polishing these floors, patching these walls, keeping everything just so. She saw value where I had only seen maintenance, and it stirred something unexpected in me. When we reached my bedroom, she paused at the window and looked out at the yard. "You have more land than I realized from the listing maps," she said. "That changes things." "Changes how?" I asked. She turned back to me with a small, knowing smile. "It makes your property more attractive, especially in this market." We sat at the dining table afterward, her folio open between us. She slid a sheet of paper toward me. At the top was a number. I blinked, certain I'd read it wrong. That's more than I ever imagined," I said. "It's not just the structure," she explained. "It's the location, the lot size, the fact that the house has been so well cared for. In the right hands, it could sell quickly, and for more than this if there's competition." I stared at the figure again. The amount could wipe away every worry I had about bills, repairs, or what would happen if my son decided to push harder. It could buy me freedom, not just from this house, but from the dynamic that had taken root within it. Elaine must have read the thoughts flickering across my face because she added gently, "I'm not saying you should sell. I'm saying you could. And if you do, you're in a strong position." Her words settled into me like a stone dropped into still water, ripples spreading outward. I saw the house differently now, not as my last tether to the life I built with my husband, but as a key. Whether I turned it in the lock was up to me. When Elaine left, I stood at the doorway watching her car disappear down the street, the number from that paper etched into my mind. For the first time in weeks, I felt the weight shift. I wasn't cornered anymore. I had options. And soon, my son would realize it too. I started small. A few flattened cardboard boxes from the grocery store, tucked behind the bedroom door where my son wouldn't notice. In the afternoons, When the light streamed softly through the curtains, I'd take one out and begin. It was the kind of packing that didn't look like packing, at least, not to an untrained eye. The china teacups wrapped in newspaper, the framed photographs slid between layers of towels, the old quilt my mother had made folded carefully into a plastic storage bin. I chose items that wouldn't be missed in the short term, the quiet, personal things that lived in corners he never looked at. Most evenings, my son wasn't home. His laughter would trail through the door as he left, keys jingling, the engine of his car fading down the street. I'd hear it from my place at the kitchen table, waiting for the sound to be gone before I rose and went back to my work. Every box felt like a small act of reclaiming. This was mine, this too, this also. Things tied to my history, not to the tension that had settled into the house like damp air. I wasn't just packing objects. I was gathering the threads of a life he seemed to have forgotten I'd lived long before he was born. Sometimes I'd pause with an item in my hand, caught between memory and motion. A seashell from our last family trip to the coast, still smelling faintly of salt. My late husband's watch, the band worn smooth where it had rubbed against his wrist. I'd hold them for a moment, letting the ache come and go, then nestle them into their places in the box. I worked in silence, but the plan was beginning to hum in my head, steady and deliberate. Elaine's number sat on a scrap of paper in my dresser drawer. The market value of the house still burned into my mind. I didn't have to tell him yet. Not until everything was in order. The boxes stacked slowly in the far corner of my closet, hidden behind coats and a garment bag. Out of sight but ready. Each night, when I slid the door shut, I felt a faint, quiet satisfaction. One evening, as I was sealing the lid on a box of books, I heard his car pull up outside. My hands moved quickly. Tucking the tape away, the box pushed back into the shadows. He came in laughing into his phone, barely glancing at me, before heading upstairs. I watched him go, my expression unreadable. He thought the house, and by extension, me, were constants. Fixtures. Something to lean on or rearrange at will. But the boxes told another story, one he hadn't even begun to suspect. A story that, before long, would change everything. It started over something small, dirty dishes in the sink, left there from the night before. I'd been meaning to get to them after my morning coffee, but he came into the kitchen like a storm. "You just leave everything for me now?" he demanded, slamming the cabinet door after grabbing a glass. I set my mug down carefully, the way you might place a fragile object you didn't want to shatter. "I was going to wash them after breakfast." He laughed, sharp and humorless. "Sure. Like you were going to help with the yard work last week, or maybe pay the rent this month. You've been here for free for years, Mom. Don't you think it's time you pulled your weight?" The words hit like ice water, but worse was the tone. Dismissive, almost bored, as if this conversation was an inconvenience. "I'm not your tenant," I said quietly. "You're acting like one," he shot back. "A lazy one at that. Honestly, you've gotten entitled. You think because you raised me, you don't have to do anything now. Well, times have changed. I have bills to pay. I can't carry you forever." Something in me shifted then, not a flare of anger, but a slow, heavy click, like a lock turning. I looked at him, really looked at him, seeing not the boy I'd rocked to sleep or the teenager I'd waited up for, but a grown man standing in my kitchen, accusing me of being a burden in the very house my name was printed on in bold letters at the county clerk's office. "You think you're carrying me?" I asked, my voice steady but colder than I'd ever spoken to him. "Do you have any idea what I carried for you? The nights I went without dinner so you could eat? The extra shifts I took when your father died so you could have school trips and birthday parties? You call that entitlement?" He rolled his eyes, muttering something about me living in the past, but I barely heard it. The decision was no longer a shadow taking shape in the back of my mind. It was solid now, weighty and certain. I didn't argue further. I simply rinsed my mug, dried it, and placed it on the shelf. He was still talking as I walked out of the kitchen, but his voice faded behind me. Upstairs, I opened my closet and looked at the neat row of hidden boxes. Each one seemed to nod back at me, quiet witnesses to what I'd been building toward. His words hadn't broken me. They'd crystallized my resolve. By the time I closed the closet door, my course was set. The next time he raised his voice at me, it would be in a house that no longer belonged to him, or to either of us. It began with the scrape of a chair against the kitchen tile, loud enough to jar the quiet of the morning. I was rinsing an apple at the sink when he dropped into the seat with a sigh that seemed meant for me to hear. "You know," he started, not looking up from his phone. "Most people your age at least try to contribute. Rent, utilities, something." I set the apple in a bowl, keeping my hands busy. "I've contributed plenty for decades." He gave a short, dry laugh. "Yeah, back when you were raising me. But that was years ago. Things are different now. You can't just live here for free forever. It's not fair to me." The words landed heavy, but the casual way he said them made them sting more. "Fair to you?" I asked. He leaned back, arms crossed. "You've gotten comfortable. Lazy, even. You act like you're entitled to stay here just because you're my mom. But the truth is, I have bills, and I'm tired of carrying you." Something inside me stilled, not out of shock anymore, but clarity. I looked at the man sitting there, the same boy I had sat beside through homework, the same child I'd nursed through fevers, the same son whose future I built with my bare hands and sleepless nights. "Carrying me?" My voice was quiet, but each word was carved sharp. "Do you know what it took to keep this roof over our heads when your father died? Do you know how many nights I went without heat so you could sleep warm? You call it entitlement. I call it love. The kind you can't measure in rent." He rolled his eyes, muttering something about me always bringing up the past, as if the past wasn't the very foundation of his present. I didn't answer. I just watched him for a moment, seeing not the son I'd once protected but the man who now measured me in dollars. And in that moment, I knew, really knew, that my decision wasn't just about leaving. It was about reclaiming the last part of myself I hadn't already given away. I finished my coffee, rinsed the cup, and set it gently in the rack. He was still talking when I left the kitchen, his voice fading behind me like a radio tuned to a station I no longer cared to hear. Upstairs, I opened my closet. The boxes were still there, hidden behind coats, each one holding a piece of my life he couldn't put a price on. I rested my hand on the top one for a moment. The argument hadn't hurt me. It had confirmed everything I'd been quietly preparing for. By the time I closed the door, my resolve was no longer just an idea. It was a date on the calendar only I could see. The pen felt heavier than it should have, its weight pressing into my fingers, as if aware of the finality it carried. The realtor's office smelled faintly of polished wood and coffee, warm, professional, and strangely impersonal, the kind of place where life-altering decisions were reduced to signatures on crisp paper. The buyer sat across from me, a pleasant woman with kind eyes and a firm handshake. She chatted easily with the realtor, their conversation drifting in and out of my awareness like background music. I nodded when expected, offered polite smiles, but my mind was elsewhere, running over the years spent in that house, the walls that had held my happiest and hardest moments, and the echo of my husband's voice in the kitchen on Sunday mornings. The deed lay in front of me, my name printed clearly at the top. My name. Not my son's. Not anyone else's. Mine. That simple fact had been my anchor through the sleepless nights of the past week, when I wondered if I was being rash, if I was letting her dictate something irreversible. But each time I pictured his face, cold, calculating, calling me lazy and entitled, in the home I had built, it hardened my resolve. The realtor pointed to the line near the bottom of the page. "Right here, Mrs. Lane. This finalizes the sale." I took the pen. My hand hovered for a moment, the faint tremor not from doubt, but from the sheer gravity of the moment. Once the ink touched the page, the house would no longer be mine. Or his. I thought of the boxes tucked neatly in my closet, already half filled with the pieces of my life I intended to take. I thought of Nora's voice on the phone, telling me it was time to stand up for myself. I thought of Mr. Daniels' knowing nod, when he told me sometimes you had to take drastic steps to protect your peace. The pen met paper. My name flowed in deliberate, steady strokes, each letter a quiet declaration. I am not a burden. I am not someone you can push out of her own home. I am the one who decides where I belong. When I set the pen down, the buyer smiled and reached across the table. "Congratulations." I returned the smile, though mine felt different, lighter, sharper at the edges. The realtor gathered the papers, sliding them into a neat folder. "We'll handle the rest. The closing date is set for next Friday." I nodded, tucking the folder into my bag. Outside, the afternoon sun felt warmer than it had in weeks. The air seemed to hum with possibility. No one at that table knew the full story. No one knew that, in just a few days, my son would walk into an empty house and realize the rent he demanded would never be paid, because the home itself was gone. Exactly 7 days after his voice had ricocheted off the kitchen walls, telling me to pay the rent or move out, I stood at the threshold of the house for what I knew would be the last time. The sale had gone through that morning. The funds were already in my account, silent proof that I had been the owner all along, no matter how loudly he had tried to rewrite the truth. The rooms were stripped bare now, each echo sharper than the last. The living room where we'd once shared movie nights was just a hollow space with sunlight spilling across the floorboards. The kitchen counters, where I prepared 1,000 meals, gleamed in their emptiness. Even the scent of the place had changed, less like home, more like possibility. The new owners were set to arrive within the hour, eager to start their own chapter in these walls. I had no intention of meeting them. This was not a day for introductions. My car was already packed, the trunk filled with the carefully chosen boxes I'd been tucking away for weeks, photographs, letters, the quilt my mother made me, and the small carved bird my husband had given me on our first anniversary. Upstairs, his room was still locked. I'd left it untouched. Let him pack it when he returned and found the deed, and his authority gone. I imagined the moment, the rattle of the doorknob, the confusion turning to realization, the sting of understanding that he'd pushed me one step too far. I walked through the house slowly, touching the walls one last time, not in grief, but in quiet acknowledgement. This house had sheltered me through storms, both literal and otherwise. It had held laughter, tears, arguments, reconciliations. But it was no longer my refuge. A home is only as safe as the people in it, and safety had left the day my own son looked at me and saw nothing but an expense. I locked the front door and slipped the keys into an envelope for the realtor to hand over. Outside, the sky was a crisp, cloudless blue, the air bright with the scent of cut grass. As I slid into the driver's seat, I didn't look back. There was no need. That chapter was closed as cleanly as the click of my seatbelt. The road stretched ahead, open and waiting, and somewhere beyond it lay a place where my worth wasn't measured in rent. By the time he returned home tonight, there would be no home to return to, at least, not for him. Only the echo of his own words, chasing him through the empty rooms he once thought were his to command. He came through the front door late in the afternoon, the smell of fried food and beer clinging to his jacket. His keys hit the hall table with a careless clatter, the same way they always had, as if this place would always be here, waiting for him. I was sitting at the kitchen table, an envelope resting neatly in front of me. He glanced at it, then at me, a frown creasing his forehead. "What's this?" "Sit," I said, my voice even. He pulled out a chair with the exaggerated sigh of someone indulging a nuisance. I slid the envelope across the table. "You should read it." He tore it open, eyes scanning quickly at first, then slowing, his expression shifting from irritation to confusion. "What the hell is this supposed to mean?" he asked, holding up the paper. "It's exactly what it says," I replied. "An official notice from the new owners. You have 30 days to vacate the property." He blinked at me, as if waiting for the punchline. "New owners? What are you talking about? This is our house." "No," I said, calm and deliberate. "It was my house. And now it belongs to someone else." His chair scraped back. "You sold it? Without telling me? You can't." I cut him off with a small, steady smile. "I could. And I did. The deed was in my name. Always has been. You told me to pay rent or move out. I chose to move out, on my own terms. And now so will you." For a moment, he just stood there, staring at me, his mouth opening and closing without sound. I could see the calculations behind his eyes, the slow comprehension that this wasn't an argument he could win with raised voices or self-righteous lectures about fairness. You can't just throw me out like this," he said finally, but the words lacked conviction. "I'm not throwing you out," I said. "The people who own the house are. I'm just delivering the message." He sank back into the chair, the eviction notice limp in his hands. "So where are you going?" "Somewhere I'm wanted," I answered simply. I didn't elaborate. I owed him no map to my future. Silence settled between us, heavy and unyielding. I arose from the table, picked up my bag, and headed for the door. As I passed him, I paused just long enough to rest my hand on the back of his chair. Actions have consequences, I said quietly. You taught me that, even if you didn't mean to. And then I walked out, leaving him alone in a house that was no longer his, holding an envelope that spelled out exactly how far his words had carried us both. He followed me onto the porch, his voice raised but unsteady. You can't just leave me here with nothing. Where am I supposed to go? The sharp edge of his tone was gone, replaced by a raw, almost boyish panic I hadn't heard since he was a child waking from nightmares. I stopped at the end of the walkway and turned to face him. He stood in the doorway clutching the eviction notice like it might change if he just gripped it hard enough. His shoulders were squared, but his eyes were wide, darting as if searching for a loophole in the air between us. You've got friends, I said evenly. You've got a job. You'll figure it out. That's not the point, he shot back, but there was no conviction behind it. He glanced over his shoulder toward the empty hall, the quiet rooms. For the first time, I think he saw them the way I'd been seeing them for months, not as a permanent safety net, but as a structure with locks and ownership that didn't include him. I've lived here my whole life, he said, softer now. Dad built. I know what your father built, I interrupted. I was here every day of it. I also know he put my name on that deed for a reason, so I'd never be at someone else's mercy in my own home. His jaw worked, but no words came out. He looked down at the paper again, tracing the bold print of the new owners' names like he might recognize them, as if that would make this more negotiable. Can't you undo this? No, I said simply. It's done. The money's in my account, and I've made my plans. You'll need to make yours. The wind caught at the eviction notice, flapping it against his hand. He didn't stop it. I could see it sinking in, that all his talk about fairness and business logic had been nothing more than bluff and bluster, and that the ground he thought he stood on had been mine all along. I didn't think you'd really, he began, then stopped. No, I said quietly. You didn't think. For a long moment, he just stood there, the sun slipping lower, shadows stretching across the porch. I waited to see if he'd lash out again, but instead, his shoulders sagged, his bravado melting into something small and uncertain. When I turned to leave, I didn't have to look back to know he was still standing there, staring at the notice in his hands, not at the words, but at the reality they carried. The house he tried to claim was no longer his shelter, and for the first time, I think he truly understood what it meant to have nowhere else to go. The apartment wasn't big, but it didn't need to be. Sunlight spilled through the wide kitchen window in the mornings, warming the little table where I now took my coffee. The rent was reasonable, the neighbors polite, and best of all, Nora was only a 10-minute walk away. The first night I slept there, I didn't hear heavy footsteps in the hallway or the sharp slam of a door at midnight. No voices raised in irritation over imagined slights. Just the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of settling wood. It was the kind of silence that doesn't make you feel lonely, it makes you feel safe. Unpacking was easy. I'd brought only what mattered: framed photos, the quilt my mother made, the recipe box worn soft at the corners. Everything else had been either sold or left behind. For years, I thought that house was an anchor, keeping me steady. I hadn't realized it was a weight I'd been dragging. Nora came over on my third evening, balancing a bottle of wine and a paper bag of takeout between her hands. Now this, she declared as she stepped inside, is what freedom looks like. We ate at my little table, laughing over old memories until the candles burned low. She told me I looked lighter, and I knew she wasn't just talking about my new haircut. In the quiet moments, I sometimes picture the old house, its walls holding echoes of birthdays and arguments alike, but the ache was softer now. I'd left those memories where they belonged, not locked behind me but released, like letting go of a balloon and watching it disappear into the sky. I thought about my son, too. Not with anger anymore, but with a kind of resigned acceptance. He would have to find his own footing now, without leaning on what I'd built. Whether he rose or fell was up to him. That weekend, Nora and I walked through the Saturday market, weaving between stalls of fresh bread and wildflowers. I bought a bunch of yellow tulips for the kitchen, and when I placed them in a jar on the table, I realized something simple but profound. Every corner of this place was mine. Every decision, every detail, every key. That night, I opened the window to let in the spring air, curling up in bed with a book. The street below was alive with soft laughter and the faint strum of a guitar. I closed my eyes, and for the first time in years, I felt no tension in my chest. It wasn't just a new address. It was a new chapter, and this time, the story was entirely my own. It was a rainy Tuesday afternoon when my phone lit up with his name. I almost didn't answer. For weeks, the silence between us had been complete, and I'd learned to live without checking my phone for his messages. But something in me, call it curiosity, or maybe that stubborn thread of motherhood that never truly frays, made me swipe to accept. His voice was quieter than I remembered, stripped of the sharp edges that used to cut into every conversation. "Hi, Mom." Just those two words, but they carried something heavier than pride, something closer to remorse. We talked about the weather first, the way people do when they're circling the thing they really need to say. Finally, he exhaled hard, like he'd been holding his breath for weeks. "I was wrong," he said. "About everything. I took you for granted. I thought you'd never push back." I let the words hang there. Once, I might have rushed to soothe him, to tell him it was all right. But I'd learned something important these past weeks. Forgiveness means more when it's not given too easily. He went on, halting at first, then faster, as if the dam had finally cracked. How he'd been couch hopping since the sale, how friends were less willing to offer a spare bed than he'd imagined. How paying rent and buying groceries with his own paycheck felt like swimming with weights on. How, in the quiet moments, he realized the meals, the clean clothes, the roof over his head, all those years, had been gifts he never truly saw. "I thought I was teaching you about fairness," he said, his voice rough. "But you were the one who taught me what it really means. And I didn't even see it until it was gone." The rain drummed softly against the window, steady and patient. I closed my eyes and let his words settle. There was truth in them, and I could hear the humility in his tone, but I also knew that trust isn't rebuilt with a single phone call. "I'm glad you've been thinking," I said finally. "And I'm glad you understand what respect looks like. But this isn't about me letting you come back. It's about you learning to stand on your own." "I know," he said quickly. "I'm not asking for that. I wanted to tell you I'm sorry. For everything." A warmth spread through me, not because the hurt was gone, but because maybe, just maybe, he was beginning to see me not as a resource, but as a person. We didn't make any promises. We didn't pretend the past hadn't happened. But when I hung up, I realized my heart felt lighter than it had in a long while. Respect, I thought, is a lesson worth the wait. The boxes in my new apartment were mostly unpacked, the last traces of cardboard and packing paper tucked away. Sunlight spilled through the wide kitchen window, catching on the rim of my coffee cup. I leaned against the counter, breathing in the scent of fresh brew and the quiet that felt as steady and sure as the walls around me. People thought the victory was in the sale, in that sharp, decisive act that caught my son off guard. And yes, there had been a certain satisfaction in it, watching the ink dry on the papers, knowing the choice was mine, not his. But sitting there now, I knew that wasn't the real triumph. The real victory was in the space I had carved out for myself, both here in this apartment and inside my own mind. For too long, I had let my life bend and twist to accommodate someone else's moods, demands, and sense of entitlement. I told myself it was love, that this was what mothers did. I'd mistaken self-sacrifice for strength. Now, the air felt different. Lighter. I woke when I wanted, walked to Nora's without checking the time, cooked dinner for one without the nagging thought of whether someone else approved. No arguments simmering under the surface, no sharp words disguised as just being honest. Just me, and that was enough. I thought about my son sometimes. About the call he'd made, the apology he'd offered. It had been sincere, I believed that. But the victory wasn't in his regret either. It was in the fact that I had stopped waiting for it. That my worth no longer hinged on whether he understood the damage he'd done. The house had been walls and floors, bricks and beams, but also memories, both sweet and bitter. Selling it was closing a chapter. Moving here was starting another. And in between those pages, I'd rediscovered something I hadn't even realized I'd misplaced, my own voice. I sipped my coffee slowly, watching the light shift across the room. For years, I thought that peace would come when everyone else finally treated me right. But it turned out peace had been waiting on the other side of a single, terrifying decision, the moment I chose to treat myself right. The real victory, I realized, wasn't about winning against my son. It wasn't even about teaching him a lesson, though perhaps he'd learned one. It was about reclaiming my dignity, my boundaries, and my right to live without fear in my own home. Outside, a breeze rustled through the leaves, carrying with it the faint sound of laughter from the street below. I smiled, not because everything was perfect, but because I finally understood. The truest kind of victory is the one you carry quietly inside, where no one can take it from you.